So why don't we open up to Matthew chapter 1. And I think I mostly stated this, but I will emphasize it again. When we read parts of the Bible that you think, that doesn't seem to have that much impact on me, or like you even might wonder, why is that in there? It's worth remembering that they wrote this on parchment. They didn't have a cool e-ink tablet with unlimited space to write on. They didn't have Microsoft Word with gigabytes, or even, they didn't even have 3.5 floppy disk drives that you could put documents on to store for forever because how could something so cool ever go out of use? They wrote on parchment, and so they had exactly as much space to write as would fit on the scroll that they had. And so every word that they wrote and every thing that they include obviously means something else has to be left out because there's not going to be room for it. And yet, both Matthew and then Luke include these long lists of names. And last week we looked at the similarities and differences. Matthew only goes back to Abraham because he's tracing that Jesus is the Messiah promised to the Jews, while Luke goes all the way back to Adam because Jesus Christ is the Savior of mankind. And so their lists are very different in some ways. There's sections of overlap, but you'll find different names there. We'll talk a little bit about where those different names come from. But now we're going to dive into the lists themselves and more so the people behind the lists. So, we just studied the book of Genesis. At least most of the book of Genesis. And so we just studied Abraham. But since Matthew starts there, perhaps we should turn to Genesis chapter 12. Can I have someone read verses 1 through 3 for
me? The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you."
So God combines a command with a promise. What's the command? And what's the promise?
Is it lever?
Well, he's in Haran at this time. So leave your chapter 12, I meant to say. Leave your parents' house, your family, everything behind, and go to the land I will show you. And what's the promise?
Make you your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you.
Yeah, I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I will curse. And all nations of the earth will be blessed through thee. What's the problem with that promise? Not that I get to question God, but I think it's worth knowing. I will.
So it says all, not this one says all peoples on earth.
Yes, peoples, nations.
Nation.
I'd have to look it up if you really know exactly what we're guessing. It's going. What's the problem with that promise?
It's not immediate.
Okay. I will make you into a great nation. What's wrong with that promise?
Well, I have no offspring at this point.
Okay, no offspring. How old is he? If you look at verse 4. And does it say how old Sarah is?
She's 10 years younger.
She's 10 years younger, but it does not say in this verse. So Sarah's 65. Lots of children on the way for 75-year-old men and 65-year-old women. We were just talking before. Raising children is a young person's game. So, how's this going to happen? Turn a few pages more to Genesis 17. Verse 3 and 4 and 5. Abraham fell on his face. God spoke with him. He said, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. Your name will not be Abram anymore, but your name will be Abraham. For I have made you the father of a large group of nations. I will make you extremely fruitful, and I will produce many nations from you." This is before Isaac is born. Hagar has borne Abraham Ishmael, but then she has despised Sarah and mocks her, and Sarah tries to send her away, or she runs away, and the Lord sends her back. And Abraham is 86 years old, and he has one son, and God says that's not the son who's going to carry the promise. What do you know about Isaac?
His name means laughter.
His name means laughter because all people will laugh with me, Sarah says. Basically, I was a laughing stock because I was an old maid with no children, but now all nations will laugh with me instead of at me. What else do you know about Isaac?
Kind of an awfully broad question.
So then it should be easy to answer because there's no wrong answers. What things do you know about Isaac?
He hadn't been born yet.
Well, we're going to assume he's going to be.
Well,
We're moving ahead. We've moved on from Abraham.
oh, I'm way behind here. I better have more coffee.
There's Yeah, he didn't have a lot of kids either. Rebecca, his wife, was barren. Rich, we have to get through 3 times 14 names this morning. So we got to be moving fast here. What else do we know about Isaac? So he didn't have many children. Who were his children? Jacob and Esau, the twins. And the older will serve the younger, Rebecca was told. I looked, and unless someone else wants to correct me, I couldn't find the Lord speaking directly to Isaac the promise that he gives to Abraham. Now, maybe my search was a little condensed, but there's only like 4 or 5 chapters to look through. You get God's promise to Jacob, and then you get Isaac blessing Jacob, but I don't see the same promise given to Isaac. But Isaac is, in a lot of ways, he is the promise. Because Abraham had no children. And St. Paul tells us Sarah considered herself as good as dead. And so Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. And the book of Hebrews tells us that it's by faith that Abraham and Sarah bore Isaac. And in Galatians, St. Paul also compares Isaac to the gospel and Ishmael to the law. Because the law depends on our actions and enslaves us, as Hagar is a slave woman, while the gospel sets us free and relies on the promise of God, as Sarah and Abraham needed to rely on the promise of God. So Isaac's very existence is God's promise in biblical speak. How about Jacob? What do you know about Jacob? The heel grabber. He's a conniver. So he tricks his brother out of his birthright, and then he tricks his father into blessing him. And then if you turn to Genesis chapter 28, you have Jacob fleeing. And the Lord, he sees the dream with the stairway to heaven, with the angels ascending and descending to the throne of God. And at the top is the Lord who says, verse 13, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. The land which you are lying I will give to your descendants. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread abroad to the west and the east and to the south. And in you and in your seed, singular, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now I am with you, and I will watch you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land. In fact, I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And then on the way back in chapter 32, the Lord repeats the same promise. Or 31. No, I'm right, 32. Sorry. Where God wrestles with Jacob. And Jacob says, I will not let you go, verse 26. I will not let you go unless you bless me. Then he said to him, what is your name? He said, Jacob. Your name will no longer be Jacob but Israel, because you have fought with God and men, and you have won. So Israel means wrestles with God, struggles with God, is what Israel means. I've seen God face to face, and my life has been spared. What do we learn about God's family from the three patriarchs?
Far from perfect.
They're far from perfect. What else do we know?
Trusted God.
They trusted in God, and their importance is only there because of God's promise. How many wealthy men do you know from 2000 BC? How many of their stories do you know? People might know some of the kings of Egypt, but I think Abraham's more famous than any Egyptian pharaoh. Jacob's more important than any ancient king or any kingdom. And why? Because God attaches a promise to them and to their family. We are going to skip way ahead to David. We'll go back if we want and if we have time. But we have to go ahead to David, to 2 Samuel chapter 7. So, background history. God chooses David, the youngest of 7 brothers, from shepherding the sheep to be king because Saul does not live up to God's standard as king, and David is the man after the Lord's own heart. David defeats Goliath, becomes famous in Israel. Saul hates him and tries to kill him for years and years and years. David is on the run. Saul dies at Gilgal in a battle with the Philistines. David is made king of Judah. He is, however, facing Abner, and the rest of the 10 tribes don't really want to accept David as king. Joab kills Abner, even though David told him that he was a fool for doing so, and Abner was a better man than Joab. But the rest of the David rules for 7 years as king of Judah, and then the rest of the 10 tribes accept David as king. And David enters Jerusalem with the Ark of the Covenant, having brought peace to Israel, and he dances before the Ark. And now the Ark and the tabernacle are sitting in Jerusalem, and David has a dream. Not an actual dream, but like desire in his heart. A vision of what he can see Jerusalem becoming. And in his vision, he sees a temple. Why should the Lord's ark dwell in a tent, while I, an earthly king, dwell in a palace, David says. And so he calls Nathan to him and says, I live in a house of cedar, but the ark of God sits under tent curtains. And Nathan said to the king, go and do everything that is in your heart, because the Lord is with you. And how embarrassing for Nathan then. Because the very next day, the Lord sends him back and says, I mean, I am with David, but you need to go deliver this message for him. And the Lord reviews the history. And then look at verse 11b. The Lord also declares to you that the Lord himself will make a house for you. When your days are complete and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up after you your seed, who will come from your own body. I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, he will be my son. When he sins, I will discipline him with a rod used by men and the blows of the sons of men. My faithful mercy will not depart from him as I removed it from Saul, whom I removed to make room for you. Your house will stand firm, and your kingdom will endure forever before you. Your throne will be established forever. What questions might arise in your mind as you read those words and think about Israel's history?
He wasn't talking about Solomon where he was. I mean, that Solomon built the temple.
I'm the one asking the question.
You didn't say that our thoughts didn't question. You said thoughts. Yeah.
So who's he talking about?
Well, he's talking about Jesus, probably. Because,
Okay.
I mean,
So,
Solomon...
Do we say about Jesus, when he sins, I will discipline him by
No, that sounds like Solomon.
Rich, I'm being mean to you, and I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Because the answer is yes to both. He is certainly, in a way, talking about Solomon. That Solomon will build a house, and Solomon will establish a kingdom, and God would not depart from Solomon like he did from Saul. Now, if you know your history, Solomon marries all the wives and follows after their gods, and because worshiping false gods is lots of fun, and it made his wives happy, and it's better to live on a corner of a roof than to spend an evening with a quarrelsome wife, and Solomon knew that times 1,000. And so, certainly, God would have had every right to strip Solomon of his kingdom like he did Saul, but over and over again he says, for the sake of my servant David, I will not take away your kingdom. What do you know about the history of the kings of Judah? You can peek at Matthew 1 if you want. Because some of those names are going to be familiar.
There were a couple who were faithful, and the rest not.
You know, when I read through the kings of Judah, I'm actually surprised, because in my memory, because they're intermixed with the kings of Israel, who are bad, 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 worse, bad, bad, terrible, bad, terrible, terrible, so terrible. And so you get distracted. I'm actually surprised by how many good ones there are. But there's only like 2 that are completely in line with David in their actions as much as possible. And even they have their own flaws. You recognize the 2 if you look at the list of kings. Which 2 might I be talking about? Probably the 2 most famous after Solomon. Hezekiah. Hezekiah, who prayed and God killed the armies of Assyria. Hezekiah, who asked for mercy and was given 15 more years of life. Hezekiah, who restored worship in the temple and did destroy the high places. That's what you often read. That this king did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He served him. He did, and they'll list some good things that he did. And it'll say, however, the high places were not removed. from Judah. And so people, even though God told them not to worship anywhere but before the Ark of His Covenant, people were doing their own thing throughout Judah, and the kings lacked the willpower or the piety or the strength to do what needed to be done to help reform God's people. So Hezekiah is one. Who's the other? This is kind of asking me to read my mind, so maybe it's unfair.
It wasn't Josiah, was it?
It is Josiah. Now get this. Josiah is refurbishing the temple. It's become a bit of a shambles and a ruin because if you don't maintain a place, it doesn't ever get better. And they're cleaning up the temple, and we're told that they found the book of the law, which makes you go, what were they doing in the temple all those years? If you could find the book of the law, so the books of Moses, they're like, that'd be like me saying, I found this old book in the sacristy, the Holy Bible. Do you think we should read that in church for a little while? Yeah, but it's a mess because there's Bibles everywhere. So Josiah, the priests find the Bible, and they say, we found this old Bible thing in our storage closet back in the corner. And they read it, and they celebrate one of the festivals for the first time, and it's a great celebration, and Josiah is a good king. But that really says something when you put it into that respect. Imagine if we didn't have a Bible in our church. What would that say about our worship life? Nothing good. And they're surprised that they find it. That's where that old thing was. So, back to David. God doesn't ever fully cut off the line. From Josiah to his son. Now, this is where Matthew confuses us, because is Jeconiah, is that supposed to be Jehoiakim or Jehoiachin? And are they the same ones in verse 11 and 12? But Matthew lists the same name twice because he's emphasizing that even though Israel's kingdom was cut off and the king was thrown into Babylon, the same line of David, the kingly line, continued after the Babylonian exile. So not even Judah's sin could stop God's promise to David from being kept true. And Rich, I said your right answer was yes. However, it's quite clear that God isn't just talking about Solomon. So God can be talking about Solomon, and he can be talking about the one who is the perfect king that would follow after David. And I think we can also say carefully, when he sins, I will discipline him with the rods of men. Not because Jesus sinned, but because, as Isaiah says, surely he bore all our sins and carried the iniquities of us all. When I see that I will discipline him with the rod used by men and the blows of the sons of men, I cannot help but fear. He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Okay, we go. So, God makes this promise to David. And that promise is established. And Matthew wants to make sure that we recognize, and you look at that list, and I'll say a majority of them are good kings on this list. Asa was a king who tried to be good. Jehoshaphat was a king who tried to be good. Uzziah was mostly a king who tried to be good, although at the end of his life, he sinned. I think he's also the one who had the foot injury. His feet rotted on him. And the Bible thought, in the book of Chronicles, we're told that his feet rotted. Katie at one point asked me, why would they tell us that? But it's a little detail you get to learn about Uzziah if you go through this list. But Manasseh was terrible. Ammon was terrible. Josiah. Ammon was so terrible. Do you remember who raised Josiah? He was raised by the priests, hidden in the temple, because the king and the queen would never go to the temple. What a silly place for the king and queen to be. And so they raised Josiah in the temple, and then when he was 12 years old, they declared him king. Because Josiah's mom killed everybody. He was a psychopath. Jeconiah, or Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin, whichever one you want to choose, and the final king Zedekiah, all terrible. And yet God's promise continues. I will make a slight correction from what I said last time, because as I looked up each one of these names more carefully to have the reference, in Ezra chapter 3, Zerubbabel is named as the son of Shealtiel. So Zerubbabel in Ezra, who helps rebuild the temple, is a direct descendant of King David. However, I don't know if it's only 3 generations or not, although that timeline works. So open up now to Matthew chapter 1. And you will find, I want you to scan and find the 4 names, perhaps 5, that aren't like the others. Four of these things are not like the others.
Well, Jacob, the father of Joseph, he wasn't a king.
No, in fact, there are no kings after Jeconiah. So that whole last 14 and the first 14 aren't kings either. Well, David was.
Rahab, Ruth.
Okay, so that's 2 of the 4. Verse 3.
Boaz was
From Bethlehem.
from
Not Ram. It does sound different. Verse 3. So we named Rahab and Ruth. Who's in verse 3? Tamar. in verse 6.
His name isn't given.
His mother had been the what? Yeah, isn't that interesting? She's not named. What's named instead? So in other words, David sinned. And then the fifth would be Mary. So who are the 4 or 5 names? Or I suppose you could say 3 or 5, because you said Bathsheba is not technically named. What makes them different? So there's 5 women listed. What do you know about each of them? Did we get as far as Judah and Tamar? In our Genesis study, I couldn't remember. No, we stopped with them getting back.
She was married to. Oh, whose son? Was she married to Perez or Terah's son?
Tamar is. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 38. Can't do it if you don't know.
That was kind of a sordid story.
It is a sordid story. So Judah has children, and he got a wife for his son You thought Ram was a weird name. And her name was Tamar. And the Lord, was a terrible human being, and the Lord rejected him and had him killed. And then Judah gave Tamar to Onan because he would carry on his brother's name. And Onan refused to fulfill his husbandly duty with Tamar. This is, by the way, where one of the verses where Catholics get that birth control is against God's law, because the Lord is angry with Onan for his method of birth control, although it's because Onan is being unfaithful to God's promise and God's desire, not so much the birth control part, but that's a different conversation. And then there's one more son, but he's just a little boy. And so Judah says, well, go live with your father, and we'll come send for you when my little boy is grown up and you can be his wife. Strange times compared to what we're used to today. All of this is almost normal for just the way that the ancient society worked. However, Judah changes his mind. And his son grows up, and he does not give the son to Tamar to be her husband. And so Tamar puts on her fanciest veil and her most shapely dress, and she sits out in the red light district, and Judah walks by, and she catches his eye, and she offers herself to him, and he says, I have nothing to pay you. And she says, well, but I'll go get money. And she says, well, then you need to leave me your cloak and your staff, because that will hold you responsible. And so Judah leaves his cloak and his staff, but then she's not there in the morning. And he's there holding the money going, where's the oldest profession? She was here yesterday, and they said, there's not a woman of that nature in this area. What are you talking about? And Judah goes home scratching his head, and 9 months later, she comes to Judah and says, I've had children. And Judah gets angry because you're supposed to be the one to carry on my line. And he says, who did this? And she said, oh, the one to whom the staff and this robe belong. And Judah recognizes that she had tricked him. And he says, she is more righteous than I, because I became the one who was trying to interrupt God's plan. So, that's Judah and Tamar. And now we're out of time. We will pick up with the women next time. And probably we'll end up devoting the whole of next time to these 4 women. If we had started on time, I might have been able to get all of it in. We had other catching up to do. So, now that you have the background, it'll be easier to put the other 3 into context and think through why these 4.